Thank you for listening to the Voices of UMass Chan, featuring the people, ideas, and advances of UMass Chan Medical School.
Welcome back to the Voices of UMass Chan. I'm Jennifer Berryman. Today, our guest is Dr. Jason Kim. Dr. Kim is a professor of molecular medicine and an expert in metabolism and type 2 diabetes, which affects millions of people around the globe. And he's here to talk about a new $3.5 million grant from the National Institute on Aging that will allow him to explore the connection between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Kim, thank you so much for making time to talk with us.
Thank you for having me here.
I was just saying before we started recording that your career has been so fascinating and you've done work literally all around the world exploring type 2 diabetes, the causes and the pathogenesis of it. Tell me about how you first got into this. Why did you choose to research this?
That's a great starting question, and many have actually asked me about that. We all have different paths to how we develop passion for the work that we do. For me, it was a personal cause. This was when I was graduating in college. I was at UC Irvine, and I had a very young aunt, young meaning she was only about 7 years older than me, but she was my aunt, who I really known quite well and grew up very close with. And of course, at the time, she lived in South Korea. Now, that's where I was born. And then I came to the US with my parents when I was young, about 12 years of age, and then I grew up in Los Angeles. And what I found out, and she seemed very healthy, and again, we spent so much time whenever I visited Korea. Then all of a sudden, I got a news from my uncle saying that my aunt had passed away.
Oh,
And that was shocking and just puzzling because this was a wonderful, beautiful young woman full of life, whom I just met, and at time, wonderful time, only the past summer, and then all of a sudden she died. So when I asked about it, it turned out she had undiagnosed diabetes, and that it progressed to some major complications, leading to a kidney failure. She
oh
was
no.
hospitalized for just about 3 days, and then she passed away. Now, I was devastated. And at the time, and this goes back to very early 1990s, I had no idea what diabetes was.
Mm.
And I wanted to find what this disease is and how such a disease can take away such a beautiful young life. And that's where my passion began.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. And she was in the prime of her life, it sounds like, when she,
Yes, indeed. And,
yeah.
and the disease has really transformed over the past 30 years since I began the work to affect more and more young people. We're talking about even teenagers are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and have to be put on medication, which, as we know, that this is a chronic disease, that we still do not have a cure for the disease. So one often has to be on medication for lifelong.
So, just to give our listeners some perspective as a reminder, so type 2 diabetes affects, is this number, could it possibly be right? 550 million people around the world. That's a staggering number.
That's
And you're
correct.
and you're saying, so obviously now, decades later, 3 decades after you suffered that personal loss, scientists and physicians know more about type 2 diabetes, but we still don't really have we have effective treatments, but we don't have a cure. So
Okay.
you went into the lab, and what were you trying to unearth?
Yes, that is absolutely true. Over the past 30 years, the work of our lab and many others, we know a lot more about type 2 diabetes than we have ever known before. So the first of the advances in the understanding of the disease is certainly has been dramatic, especially over the last 2 decades, because type 2 diabetes, which is closely and causally associated with obesity, and of course, we know obesity has been an epidemic event that it affects globally, and the populations is skyrocketing over the years. And that almost explains why type 2 diabetes prevalence has also been rising at an equal rate. And this field has gone through really an important and exciting paradigm shift. Type 2 diabetes that was once perceived as a disease of an abnormal sugar metabolism, therefore causing imbalanced glucose levels and elevated glucose levels in your blood, the hallmark of diabetes. But over the last 2 decades, we've come to understand that obesity as a cause of type 2 diabetes is a chronic inflammatory state, and that inflammation may be the important link between obesity and type 2 diabetes. And in that spectrum, we're learning a lot more every day about how this new paradigm is shaping the new understanding of type 2 diabetes, and hopefully new ways to treat the disease in the future.
Right. And so that is still, though, aspirational, right? In terms of finding a new treatment that treats the inflammation. People with type 2 diabetes are still taking insulin for the most part, right?
That's correct. Yes. So the inflammation definitely plays an important role, but it is somewhat different than what most of us consider kind of inflammation to be an important and beneficial event for our body when we have to fight these common infections. So it's a little bit different kind of framework. Those that develop the inflammation that develop in response to an infection is a huge, a massive inflammatory response that our immune cells are activated and respond to any source of invasion by toxins or outside agent like viruses. But the obesity, the inflammation that develops in obesity is more of a kind of a low-grade inflammation that is much more chronic in duration, of course. So my laboratory has really been studying what causes that low-grade chronic inflammatory response in our body, and then what type of cells are involved in this process, and then how they then cause what is known as insulin resistance, which is the major characteristic of type 2 diabetes, where our hormone insulin is unable or less able to regulate our blood glucose level, to understand how inflammation leads to this event.
Fascinating. So I want to talk now about this new realm of research that you're going to be diving into. So it's so interesting as a non-physician, the correlations between these various diseases that have been discovered. And so there's not only a strong correlation between type 2 diabetes and obesity, but there's also a strong correlation between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease.
That's absolutely correct. The studies have shown that about 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease have type 2 diabetes. And this cannot be just purely coincidental. There must be a biological connection between these two common human diseases.
Tell us more about that. 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease have type 2 diabetes?
That's correct. So to tell you a little bit, since I've had a chance to introduce to all of you about type 2 diabetes, I want to give you a little bit about the Alzheimer's disease. Now, it is the population is equally striking. It affects about 7 million Americans, or globally, more than 40 million people around the world. Now, Alzheimer's disease, as we all know, is an aging disease that affects more than 70% of those 75 years old and older. It is also an irreversible, a neurodegenerative disease with declining memory and cognitive function and personality changes. Now, just like diabetes, there are 3 currently FDA-approved drugs for treating Alzheimer's disease, but none is intended to cure the disease, as they simply slow the progression of the disease. So there's no doubt there is a strong need to better understand this disease. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The cases of the Alzheimer's disease, just like diabetes and obesity, are rising throughout the world. And we all ask, why is that the case? Now, just like how I described how type 2 diabetes has gone through a share of changing, kind of a evolving paradigm, we call it. The Alzheimer's disease has gone through a similar kind of phenomenon. Now, traditionally, it involves a loss of brain function and brain cell death, and the well-known hallmarks include formation and accumulation of these undesirable protein deposits that are famously known as amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And I know these are kind of a lot of scientific terms, but these are basically protein aggregates that accumulate and they spread throughout the brain as the disease progresses, and they affect the brain function and eventually cause neuronal death. Now, traditionally, people have thought that the Alzheimer's disease as really as a disease of dying neurons as a result of this protein aggregation.
Mhm.
But it's quite possible that these events that we all know so well may simply be a manifestation of disease, not the actual causality. And what's really exciting is that some recent studies are indicating that in Alzheimer's disease, the brain is also developing inflammation. We call it neuroinflammation. And that may possibly occur in the early stage of the disease and may contribute to disease progression. So you begin to see some similar features between Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes. And that's what we are keen to investigate and try to understand more.
So, what will that research look like, and who will you be collaborating with?
Yes, so very important questions. So I have to admit that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the government agency that funds our research, really recognizes important trend and connection between these two human diseases that are very common, Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes. So that actually was the goal when the NIH and the National Institute on Aging released a notice of special interest aimed at improving our understanding of how age-associated metabolic changes in peripheral organs or in the brain affect the onset or progression of Alzheimer's disease. So when I saw that last spring, now I, as a leading expert in diabetes and metabolism, found out who might be the right neurobiologist at UMass Chan Medical School campus to join me in this exciting collaborative venture. And that's when I found and teamed up with Dr. Doris Schaefer, a bright young neuroscientist who's making a name for herself as a leading figure in dementia research, as a co-investigator on this grant to put forth an exciting and innovative paradigm that could potentially explain this important connection between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease.
What will the study look like? What will you and Dr. Schaefer do?
So the premise of our investigation is really in two folds. Again, the notion and really the newly perceived notion that Alzheimer's disease involves this inflammation in the brain, and connecting that to our type 2 diabetes is also a disease of an inflammatory state. So we want to understand, and of course, we've been studying that important notion on the role of inflammation as a cause of type 2 diabetes. So our goal is to bring these two together to ask a fundamental question, whether peripheral inflammation that develops in obesity and type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance may contribute to brain inflammation, leading to Alzheimer's disease, and how changes in peripheral metabolism may be an early event in the progression of both of these diseases.
Mhm.
And this is where I find this grant to be also timely, because last year I received another NIH grant to study metabolic liver disease, which is a major comorbidity of type 2 diabetes.
Mhm.
And it turns out that one of the key features of the metabolic liver disease is also inflammation and insulin resistance that leads to a common liver disease known as metabolic dysfunction associated steatohepatitis, known as MASH. And this is where it gets really even more exciting. There's also a strong correlation between this metabolic liver disease and Alzheimer's disease,
Yeah.
really bringing these things all together with a central theme being inflammation at the center of what potentially maybe these three common human diseases.
So are there biomarkers that you'll be looking for, or how do you go about figuring out what comes first and what's causing the inflammation?
Yes, that's an outstanding question. Of course, discovering new biomarkers that can help us identify and early diagnose these diseases is always key. And that's something that is certainly in kind of a downstream path of our current research. But what we at this time want to understand is this biological timeline of event, as you alluded right there. When it comes to a chronic and progressive disease, it's important to understand what happens early on as opposed to what simply shows up later on, because oftentimes what happens early tends to be causally related to what happens when a disease is fully onset. So we are using mouse models. These are known as transgenic or genetically engineered mouse models that mimic the human Alzheimer's disease condition. And we are studying them as the animals age at different ages, from young to middle age, and as they get older. As the Alzheimer's disease pattern begins to show, but we want to know what happens during the early stage when it comes to the changes in inflammation and metabolism in peripheral organs, meaning organs outside the brain, as well as within the brain.
That is fascinating. And as we said earlier, timely research that potentially has implications for 500 million people or more around the globe. So we will certainly be watching closely to see what you and Dr. Schaefer are able to learn. And congratulations on this new grant.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to talk about this exciting grant. And of course, I have to thank and really be grateful to the support of the NIH to help us pursue our investigation and conduct our research, which we think that we may be able to uncover a new pipeline of exciting therapeutic strategies to treat Alzheimer's disease and possibly targeting outside of the brain. Just imagine that. We may be able to target Alzheimer's disease, a disease of the brain, but outside of the brain, thereby minimizing the undesirable effects of CNS targeting drugs.
Yeah, that public investment in science and discovery is so critical. It's really the foundation of so many health discoveries that have been made over the past century. So Dr. Jason Kim, Professor of Molecular Medicine at UMass Chan Medical School, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's been a great pleasure to tell you all about our research. And I especially do want to thank the UMass Chan Medical School for giving me the place and all the excitement and support to continue our exciting research.
And thank you for joining us. If there is a specific topic you'd like to hear about on the Voices of UMass Chan, email us at umasschancommunications@umassmed.edu. I'm Jennifer Berryman. We'll see you next time.
Follow us at UMass Chan on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. On YouTube, find us at UMass Chan Medical School.